What would you do if the man you were about to marry looked you in the eye and called you a curse in front of everyone? On what should have been the most beautiful day of her life, a young bride stands in a grand cathedral only to be humiliated in a way no one could have imagined. But just as her world shatters, a voice from the shadows rises, calm, powerful, and impossible to ignore. In a single moment, everything changes. And the man who speaks those words may be more dangerous and more determined than anyone in that room realizes. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Now let's begin the story. The upstairs room in the Vale estate was so quiet, Eloan could hear the clock arguing with time. Tick, pause, tick. Morning light slid through a thin curtain and touched the ivory gown hanging beside the mirror as if it were sacred. The lace sleeves looked like they belonged to someone who knew how to be celebrated. The silk skirt fell in obedient lines, smooth and perfect, like it had been made for a life that never hesitated. Eloan Vale stood before the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. The dress fit her as if it had always been meant for her. The waist sat exactly right. The neckline framed her collarbones with a modest elegance. The veil lay over her dark hair like soft snow. And yet her eyes were empty, clear awake, and distant, as though she had already left this room hours ago. She rested both hands lightly over the front of the gown, fingers spreading across the fabric at her waist. Not trembling from excitement, not trembling from nerves, trembling from the feeling that she did not belong inside her own reflection. Her fingertips tightened on the lace. She felt the threads bite into her skin. It anchored her to something real. A voice cold familiar, sharpened by years, rose from memory as cleanly as if it had been spoken behind her. Some daughters bring fortune, others bring ruin. Eloan's eyelids lowered. Her breath thickened. For a moment the clock seemed louder, the air heavier, the walls closer. She whispered, barely moving her lips, as if the room itself might punish her for wanting anything. Just today. Let it be different. She opened her eyes again. The woman in the mirror did not look like someone waiting to be chosen. She looked like someone waiting to find out what she would be called this time. She turned slightly, just enough to see the gown from the side. The silhouette was flawless. The effect would be flawless. Everyone would agree she looked beautiful. Beauty, she had learned, was not protection. It was only something people could use against you when they decided you did not deserve it. The whispers had followed her all her life, trailing behind her like a shadow with teeth. She was born in the night. Her mother died. Nothing good follows that girl. Sometimes it was said quietly behind gloved hands at garden parties. Sometimes it was said by servants when they thought she could not hear. Sometimes it was said openly in the drawing room with a smile that pretended it was concern. Eloan had been taught to accept the word they used for her as if it were a fact, like the weather. Curse. Flashbacks came the way storms did, fast, sharp, and unavoidable. A dark room, a candle sputtering, a thin wail of a newborn cutting through exhaustion. A woman on a bed, pale as linen, a sheet being drawn up slowly, carefully, as if covering something precious. Someone whispering, not cruelly, but with the quiet certainty of people who like their tragedies simple. It began with her. Then other images overlaid the first. A winter when the crops failed. She had been 8, watching her stepmother's mouth tighten as letters arrived, hearing the word ruin like a prayer. A bold investment that collapsed. A family friend dying unexpectedly. A carriage accident on the road outside town. Each event ended with the same conclusion, delivered like a verdict. It's because of her. In every memory, Eloan was not at the center of the disaster. She was merely the object to blame once the disaster arrived. She had stopped feeling outraged about it years ago. Now she only felt resigned, like a person who has lived too long in a cold house and no longer remembers what warmth is supposed to feel like. She faced the mirror again. The dress still fit. The veil still looked ethereal. Her eyes had learned to accept. On the table beside the window sat a framed portrait. Lord Edwin Vale, her father caught in oil paint, at a younger age his gaze gentle and tired, as if he had already known what life would ask him to endure. Eloan crossed the room and touched the frame with 2 fingers, careful, reverent. In her mind his voice returned, not booming, not commanding, but steady and intimate in a way that had once saved her. You are not what they say, Eloan. She remembered him standing between her and Lady Marceline in the library, one hand braced on the chair back, as if he could hold the whole house still. Enough, he had said. She is my daughter. For 7 years he had been her shield, not strong enough to stop the arrows, but willing to take the worst of them on his own body. Then another memory replaced it. A dark room, curtains drawn, the smell of medicine, coughing that never ended, hands shaking, the moment his fingers loosened around hers and did not tighten again. A quiet, unbearable finality. In the present, Eloan let her hands slip from the frame. The warmth of his imagined protection faded as quickly as it came. Her voice cracked before she could stop it. You promised! No answer came. Only the clock measuring the silence with indifference. From the hallway, laughter drifted toward her. Bright, effortless, familiar. Lysandra. The door to Eloan's room was slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening she caught a glimpse of her half-sister surrounded by maids. Lysandra stood in pale silk, her hair being pinned and repinned like she was a crown being built. Her face was calm, luminous, the kind of beauty that had always drawn attention without ever asking for it. A maid's voice floated in adoring. You would have made a breathtaking bride, my lady. Lysandra smiled, eyes flicking briefly toward Eloan's mirror as if she could see her through walls. Some things simply fall where they belong. No need for more. The meaning was complete. Eloan turned back to her mirror and adjusted her sleeve. Not because it needed adjusting, because it gave her something to do with her hands besides shake. She did not respond. She did not protest. She did not ask why her own sister could speak like that about her. She had learned long ago that Lysandra's cruelty didn't come from rage. It came from certainty that she would always be the one chosen first. Another memory rose uninvited, and for a moment the room smelled like summer instead of old linen. Cedric Ashburn in the garden, sunlight on his hair, his smile practiced and warm. You're different from the rest of them. Eloan had stood at the edge of the path, fingers wrapped around a book she hadn't been able to read. She remembered the way she had tried to keep her voice calm, different. In a good way, Cedric's smile widened, and he stepped closer as if closeness itself was a gift. In the only way that matters. Then he took her hand. The first man to take her hand with intention, not pity. She had felt something rise in her chest, hope sharp and dangerous. The image had frozen there in her mind, like a painting, his fingers around hers, his gaze on her face, the illusion of being chosen. Back in the present, Eloan's fingers tightened again on the lace at her waist. She had believed him, and belief, she was learning, was the most vulnerable thing she possessed. The door opened softly, and Iris slipped inside. The air changed as soon as she entered. Not warmer exactly, but less sharp. Iris had always carried a kind of grounded steadiness that made Eloan's thoughts feel less like a storm. Iris took one look at her and went still. Then she forced a smile. "You look beautiful." Eloan didn't turn. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's life," she said quietly. Iris hesitated. Her gaze darted briefly toward the gown, the veil, the perfect illusion of a happy bride. Then she lowered her voice. "But something about this doesn't feel right." Eloan's eyes stayed on her own reflection. "It's too late to question it now." Iris stepped closer. "Then promise me if something feels wrong, you won't ignore it." Eloan's mouth curved into a thin smile. "I've ignored worse." Iris's hand reached for hers, fingers closing around Eloan's cold knuckles with fierce affection. For a second, Eloan allowed it. Then gently she pulled away, not rejecting Iris, but protecting the fragile calm she needed to survive the next few hours. A knock sounded at the door. "It is time, Miss Vale." Eloan's spine straightened in a way that felt automatic. Ritual, performance, survival. She drew in a long breath and looked one final time into the mirror. No longer the girl they called the curse. Only a bride. Her thoughts cut clean through fear. This is the only way out. She stepped forward. Downstairs, the estate was bustling with the controlled frenzy of preparation. Footsteps, muffled voices, the rustle of skirts and the clink of a tray being carried too fast. Eloan moved through it like a ghost. Outside, the carriage waited. The air was cool, clean, smelling faintly of damp earth and distant rain. She climbed in, Iris following behind to settle the veil and straighten the skirt with careful hands. Iris leaned close enough that only Eloan could hear her. "If he hurts you," Eloan cut her off softly. "Don't," she murmured, "not today." The carriage rolled forward. The world outside, blurred houses and trees passing like scenery. Eloan watched it all without really seeing it. Her thoughts narrowed to one point. The church doors that would open the aisle. She would walk down the man waiting. The church was large old stone and stained glass, beautiful in a way that felt cold rather than comforting. Sunlight poured through colored windows and painted the pews in blue and gold. The effect should have been warm. Instead, it felt like a stage lit for a performance. The guests had already gathered, filling the space with expensive fabric and quiet judgment. Eloan heard the whispers even before she entered. Strange match. The sister would have been more fitting. No one said it loudly. They didn't need to. The church carried sound too well. She stood just inside the side entrance, listening, as if the words were part of the hymn. Then she saw him. At the far back, partially obscured by a column, in the slanting light, a man sat perfectly still. His posture was straight hands, placed calmly, his gaze forward, as if he were not there to be entertained. Duke Alaric Thornfield. Not many turned to look at him, but those who recognized him fell quiet in a way that felt instinctive. A respect so deep it didn't require announcement. Eloan had never spoken to him. She had seen him only at a distance at events where he appeared briefly, said little, and left without the kind of flirting and public charm other men used as currency. He did not belong to her world, not really. And yet, as she stepped forward into the main entrance and the music began, she felt his gaze land on her. It did not linger. It did not devour. It did not pity. It simply registered her, like a person noticing something real in a room full of costumes. The doors opened fully. The aisle stretched ahead like a narrow bridge over deep water. Alaric began to walk. No one waited for her with softness in their eyes. No face glowed with joy at her approach. Most watched with curiosity, others with cold appraisal, and a few with the kind of detached boredom reserved for events they already understand. Her steps echoed on stone. The skirt trailed behind her, heavy and obedient, but there was no feeling of triumph in the motion. Only endurance. Just this once. Let me not be the mistake. She reached the front. Cedric stood waiting near the altar, dressed impeccably. His hair perfectly set, his expression composed in the way a man's expression should be on the day he claims something beautiful. He turned as she approached, and for a fraction of a second, Alaric searched his face for something familiar, something kind, something that matched the garden sunlight memory. What she found instead was distance. He extended his hand with flawless timing. The gesture was right. But when her fingers touched his, she felt it coldness. Not physical temperature, something else. A refusal to connect. As if he were holding an object rather than a person. The priest began voice echoing. "We are gathered here today." The words rose and fell in practiced rhythm. Alaric kept her gaze forward, breathing carefully, her body holding itself upright through sheer discipline. From the pews, she felt the weight of attention. No blessing. Only observation. Cedric's hand tightened around hers for a brief moment, not in reassurance, but as if to remind her to remain in place, to play her part correctly. The priest moved to the vows. The church quieted further, as if every guest had leaned forward in their minds. "Will you?" Cedric was meant to speak. One beat passed. Two. Cedric did not. Alaric turned her head slightly, confusion rising. "Cedric," she whispered. He did not look at her. Instead, he laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than breath. But in the charged silence, it struck like a coin dropping onto stone. Alaric felt her heartbeat trip. Cedric turned away from her, pivoting smoothly toward the crowd, like an actor acknowledging his audience. His smile grew no longer hidden. "You thought I'd marry you." A few gasps sliced through the pews. Alarin's hand hovered where his had been suddenly empty. He continued, voice clear, almost delighted. "You're a curse." The church froze. No movement, no cough, no shuffling of feet. The word fell into the room like a stone dropped into deep water, heavy, final, and impossibly familiar to Alaric. For a moment she didn't react, not because she hadn't heard him, because she had heard it too many times in her life. Her mind went oddly quiet, as if part of her had always been prepared for the moment someone said it loudly enough that there was no escaping it. Cedric looked satisfied, watching the ripple of shock spread through the guests. Then he shifted his gaze toward the front pews. "The woman I love is her." Every head turned. Lysandra rose. She moved with grace, not startled, not ashamed, only certain. Her silk dress caught the stained glass light and shimmered like she had been meant to be seen. She stepped down the aisle as though this were her ceremony. When she reached Cedric, she placed her hand into his without hesitation. The gesture was natural, intimate, in the way of people who have practiced touching each other when no one is looking. Alaric stared at them. Lysandra tilted her head, her voice soft enough to sound affectionate, sharp enough to cut. "You always knew your place, didn't you?" Cedric's fingers tightened on Lysandra's hand as if to confirm the statement. Around them whispers began to bloom, no longer speculation, but confirmation. They've been seeing each other for months. Everyone knew but her. Elowen heard the words as if from far away, but each one landed with perfect clarity. She saw flashes Cedric leaving early from dinners, Lysandra missing at the same time. The way their eyes had met across rooms quick and confident, while Elowen had stood beside them like furniture. The pieces slid into place too perfectly, too late. Elowen's gaze shifted slow inevitable toward Lady Marceline. Her stepmother stood rigidly in the front row, chin-lifted gloved hands folded as if this were merely an unfortunate social complication. Elowen waited some instinctive hope, foolish and stubborn, that perhaps even now Lady Marceline would step forward and say, "Enough." Instead, Lady Marceline spoke, her voice loud enough for those nearby to catch and spread. "It's unfortunate, but not unexpected. No defense, no outrage, no sign that Elowen had ever been considered a daughter worth protecting." Elowen held her gaze on Lady Marceline for a long second, then looked away. Behind her, someone laughed, a small sound quickly stifled, then another. Not everyone laughed, but enough did that it became part of the air. A woman whispered, "A curse indeed." Elowen stood in the center of the altar space. Her dress still perfect, her veil still draped, her hands still folded, as a bride's hands should be. And yet, everything had become meaningless. Her fingers clenched the fabric at her skirt so tightly her knuckles blanched. But she did not cry. She did not shout. She did not run. Something inside her went still, as if her heart had stepped back from her body and watched from a distance. So this is what I am. No pain. Only emptiness. Then a voice cut through the ruined calm and unmistakably male. "If no one here will stand for her, I will." It came from behind. Not loud, just certain. The laughter stopped. The whispers died mid-breath. Every head turned, as if pulled by the same string. At the back, Duke Alaric Thornfield rose to his full height. He didn't hurry. He didn't hesitate. He simply stood as if that single action redefined the room. Those who recognized him dropped their gazes instinctively. Respect moved through the church like a silent command. Cedric's face drained of color. Lysandra's hand tightened on his, not in affection, but in alarm. Alaric began to walk. His steps were unhurried, steady, measured. Each one was a decision. He did not look at Cedric. He did not look at Lysandra. His eyes were for Elowen. When he reached the front, he stopped close enough that Elowen could hear the controlled rhythm of his breathing. He spoke clearly, his voice low, and even carrying through the stunned silence. "Elowen Vale, I shall marry you." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling, clean and resonant. Elowen's body reacted before her mind did. She took a small step back, not from fear, from disbelief. Her voice came out thin, almost broken by sheer confusion. "You don't even know me." Alaric met her gaze without blinking. "I know enough. No explanation, no performance, no attempt to soften the impact, just a statement that sounded like truth." Elowen searched his face instinctively for pity, the kind of pity that would make this feel humiliating in a new way, like a charity offered in public. She found none. What she saw instead was certainty, a calm intent that did not waver, as if he had chosen this outcome long before the moment required him to speak it, as if he were not saving her from disgrace, as if he were claiming something he had already decided was his responsibility to protect. Elowen turned her head and looked around the church. Cedric stood rigid, jaw-clenched, eyes burning with disbelief. Lysandra's confidence had fractured. She looked suddenly like a woman who had miscalculated the world's rules. Lady Marceline's expression had tightened into something sharp and cautious, like a predator realizing the prey has become too expensive to touch. No one moved toward Elowen. No one called her name. Not even Iris, who stood several rows back, eyes wide with shock and fierce hope, could bridge the distance between Elowen and the altar. Elowen's throat tightened. She understood in a single stark instant that if she remained here, she would remain what they wanted her to be: a spectacle, a lesson, a warning. She turned back to Alaric. He did not extend his hand as an order. He simply waited. Elowen held the silence for one breath, two. Then she spoke, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. Very well. The entire church seemed to exhale at once. The priest looked as though he might faint. His eyes flicked between Alaric and the guests, searching for someone to tell him this could not be done. No one spoke, because in that moment the church belonged to the Duke's will. The priest cleared his throat, hands trembling slightly around the book. My lord," he stammered. This is highly irregular." Alaric's gaze shifted briefly to him. Not threatening, simply absolute. "Continue," he said, and the priest did. The second ceremony did not have flowers arranged for it. No music adjusted to welcome it. No planned smiles. It was cold in its simplicity, stripped down to the rawest bones of vow and witness. Elowen's hand moved into Alaric's when he offered it. This time the warmth was real, solid, not possessive, not performative. A human hand holding another human hand as if it mattered. Cedric stepped forward suddenly, unable to contain himself. "This is absurd." His voice cracked against the stone and stained glass like an object thrown in desperation. Alaric did not turn to look at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not dignify the outburst with anger. "You've said enough," he replied. The simplicity of it was devastating. Cedric stopped mid-step, as if the air had thickened into a wall. The priest asked the vows, again voice-shaking, words now heavy with the weight of history being rewritten in real time. Elowen spoke her "I do" with a quiet steadiness that surprised even her. Alaric spoke his with the same calm certainty he had carried down the aisle. When the priest finished, when the words that declared them bound were finally spoken, something shifted in the church. Not joy, not celebration, a deep stunned stillness, like a world rearranging itself. Elowen didn't look at Cedric or Lysandra again. She didn't glance at Lady Marceline. She kept her eyes forward on the man beside her and the door ahead. Alaric guided her away from the altar. As they passed the front pew, Lady Marceline's lips parted, as if she might speak, might attempt one last form of control. But Alaric didn't slow. He did not grant her the power of even a sentence. They walked down the aisle together, the same aisle Elowen had walked alone only minutes earlier. The guests shifted, not stepping into their path, but not quite retreating, either caught between curiosity and fear, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. Elowen felt the air change as they neared the doors. The outside world waited beyond sharp and bright compared to the church's stained glass gloom. At the threshold, Elowen's heart thudded once heavy. She wasn't sure what came next. She only knew with a clarity that cut through everything that for the first time in her life, she was not the one left behind. Alaric's hand remained steady around hers, as if he had never intended to let go. as if the word curse had finally met something stronger than rumor, a choice. And Elowen stepped out of the church into the cold, clean air, no longer a girl being discarded, no longer a bride being mocked, but a woman walking forward beside a man who had stood up in a room full of silence and decided the story would not end there. What made a powerful duke choose the one girl everyone else called unlucky? And what if there's a secret about her that no one in that church truly knows yet? Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most unforgettable part of the story. The church doors opened, and a blade of cold air cut through the heavy silence behind them. Elowen stepped into it as if she were walking out of a dream she had not agreed to have. The gravel outside crunched underfoot. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a carriage horse stamped impatiently. The sky was the pale gray of an afternoon that could not decide whether it would rain again. Duke Alaric Thornfield did not look back. He did not offer a final glance to the pews full of frozen faces or to the altar where the ruin had begun. He simply kept Elowen's hand in his steady, warm, unyielding, and guided her down the steps as though this was the most natural conclusion in the world. On either side, guests stood in a stunned corridor of silk and disbelief. Their eyes followed Elowen, but the quality of those eyes had changed. It was no longer the easy contempt reserved for the girl who could be mocked without consequence. Now it was the cautious stare given to something that had become dangerous to underestimate. No one stopped them. No one called her name. Not Cedric, not Lysandra, not Lady Marceline. Elowen walked as if the air were thick and soundless, as if her mind had wrapped itself in fog to keep from collapsing under the weight of what had just happened. She heard everything too clearly. Anyway, her shoes on stone, the faint whisper of her skirt, the soft clicks of the doors moving behind them, the wheels of the Duke's carriage shifting as the driver prepared to depart. When they reached the carriage, Alaric opened the door and held it with the quiet competence of a man who did not perform courtesy. He simply lived it. Elowen paused. For half a second, she stared into the shadowed warmth of the carriage interior, as if it were another threshold she might not be allowed to cross. Then she looked up at him. He did not hurry her. He did not insist. He only lowered his voice so low it felt meant for her alone. "You are safe with me." It was such a simple sentence that it should not have pierced her the way it did. Her throat tightened. She swallowed once hard and stepped up into the carriage. The door closed with a soft finality, and the world outside was cut away. No stained glass light, no whispering mouths, no laughter. Only polished wood, the faint scent of leather, and the steady rhythm of the wheels as the carriage began to roll. Alaric sat across from her, posture straight, hands resting on his knees. His face was calm to the point of unreadable, not cold, controlled, like the still surface of deep water. Elowen lowered her gaze to her own hands. Lace still hugged her wrists. Her fingers were marked with faint red lines where she had clenched her skirt too tightly for too long. The church fell away behind them, shrinking into memory with every turn of the wheels. Somewhere inside her, a small part of her mind whispered, "It's over." And another part, louder and more terrified, answered, "Something else has begun." For a long time, she said nothing. She listened to the steady roll of the carriage, the faint creak of wood, the distant murmur of London beyond the curtains. When she finally spoke, her voice came out hoarse, as if it had to push through ice. Was this pity Alaric did not answer immediately? He watched her for a beat as if measuring the question not by its words, but by what it cost her to ask it. Then he replied low and firm, "No. If it were, I would have acted long ago." Eowyn lifted her head. The answer did not comfort her. It unsettled her. Long ago, the words slipped out before she could stop them. Alaric's gaze shifted briefly toward the window to the blurred shape of wet streets passing by, then returned to her. When he spoke again, there was no ornament in his tone, no romance, no attempt to make himself sound noble. "I did not stand today because I suddenly noticed you." Alaric's heartbeat tightened painfully. Alaric continued, voice steady. "I stood because what happened today should never have been allowed to happen to you." Something in her expression must have changed, because his eyes softened, not into pity, never that, but into a kind of grim understanding. Alaric stared at him for a long moment, searching for the frantic impulse of a man who had done something reckless in public. She found instead the controlled presence of someone who had chosen his moment and used it, as if he had been waiting. The carriage rocked gently as it turned onto another street. Rainwater glittered on cobblestones outside. Alaric watched it in the corner of her vision, then looked back at him. "Then when did you notice me?" she asked, and her voice sounded too small for the enormity of the question. Alaric leaned back slightly against the seat, not relaxed, but settled. "The first time was outside Whitmore Street." Alaric frowned faintly. "It was raining," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself, hard enough that most people were running for shelter. A memory rose in her mind, blurred at first, then sharp. A crowded street, umbrellas colliding, a woman's bag spilling its contents into a puddle, an elderly woman bending with trembling hands, trying to gather apples and paper parcels, while people skirted around her as if kindness were inconvenient. Alaric saw herself in that memory, soaked through, removing her shawl and draping it over the old woman's head. Alaric watched her face, as if he could see the memory moving behind her eyes. "You were already drenched," he said, "yet you stood there in the rain, as if your discomfort meant nothing compared to hers." Alaric shook her head, embarrassed by the attention being paid to something she'd never considered worthy of notice. Anyone would have helped her. Alaric's reply was immediate calm and quietly devastating. No, they did not. Alaric went still because she remembered it now. How many people had glanced and moved on. How the old woman had looked at her with surprise, as if she'd been rescued by a creature thought extinct. The carriage rolled on. Silence grew thick for a moment. Then Alaric spoke again. The second time was at Lady Winford's garden party. Eowyn's eyes lifted with surprise. He remembered that she barely remembered that. She had attended because Lady Marceline insisted, because it was proper to present herself even if no one cared to see her. She had spent most of the afternoon near the edges of conversation, smiling when spoken to, waiting for the hour to pass. Alaric's voice was measured as if he were laying stones in a path for her to follow. There was one seat left beside the Duchess's cousin. You had every right to take it. Your name had been called. Eowyn's mind flicked back. Yes, she remembered the hush, the attention, the moment that could have pulled her into the center of the room. And then the girl beside her, a young woman with trembling hands, her mother gripping her arm too tightly, whispering sharp instructions in her ear. Alaric remembered stepping back. "She looks more frightened than I feel," Alaric had said softly. "Let her have it." Alaric held her gaze. "You gave away the one moment that could have placed you in the center of that room." Alaric frowned, still not understanding why that mattered. It was only a chair. Alaric's eyes didn't flinch. No, it was a choice. And very few people choose kindness when attention is within reach. Alaric looked down at the folds of her gown. She had spent years believing her choices didn't matter. Hearing him speak of them like they were real, like they were visible, made something in her chest ache. The carriage turned again, leaving the busiest streets behind. The city thinned. Trees appeared, their branches dark against the gray sky. Alaric's voice lowered a fraction, as if he knew what he was about to touch. The third time was the night of the Holloway Music Hall. Elowyn's head snapped up, her stomach tightened sharp. That night lived in her memory like a bruise that never faded. A pearl necklace missing. A room in chaos. A servant claiming she'd seen Alaric near the dressing table last. Lady Marceline's eyes narrowing as if proof were unnecessary. Alaric's jaw tightened. It was found later, she said, voice stiff, with the old humiliation. In Lysandra's own shawl case. Alaric nodded once. I know. Something shifted in Alaric's face, real shock this time. He went on calmly, but with weight. What I remember is not that the necklace was found, he said. What I remember is that while others were ready to let you bear the disgrace, you did not defend yourself by shaming anyone in return. Alaric's gaze dropped. Her voice when it came was small and honest. No one would have believed me anyway. Alaric's eyes stayed on her. That does not make your restraint weakness. The words landed softly, but they had force. Alaric felt them settle somewhere inside her where all the old accusations lived. Silence filled the carriage again, but it was different now. Not empty, not hostile. Alaric turned her face toward the window, watching trees blur past, feeling as if she were floating between worlds. And you heard what they call me, she said. At last, not quite a question, not quite an accusation. Yes, Alaric answered without hesitation. Alaric let out a short, hollow laugh. Then you knew enough to stay away. Alaric's reply cut through her like clean steel. No, I knew enough to know they were wrong. Alaric turned back to him, startled. She had heard the word curse repeated so many times that it had become part of her name in her own mind. But no one had ever said, simply, with such certainty, that it was wrong. Alaric spoke slowly, each word deliberate. People call what they do not wish to understand a curse, he said. It is easier than admitting cruelty, weakness, or cowardice. Alaric's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt again, not in panic this time, but in a strange aching attempt to hold on to the moment. Because something was happening that terrified her more than humiliation. She was being seen. The carriage slowed. Beyond the window, an iron gate appeared, black, tall, precise. It opened between two perfectly trimmed rows of trees that formed a corridor of green, even in this muted season. Alaric stared as the carriage passed through, and the world outside shifted. Thornfield House rose ahead, broad and balanced and quiet, not flamboyant, not desperate to impress. It carried a kind of restrained authority, as if the building itself had never questioned its place in the world. Stone steps gleamed pale. Dark wooden doors stood tall. Windows reflected the gray sky like watchful eyes. It didn't feel cold. It felt solemn, as though it demanded honesty from anyone who entered. The carriage stopped. Alaric stepped down first, then turned and offered his hand. Alaric took it automatically, then realized the second of the two greetings waiting at the door was meant for her. A tall, older man bowed his head. Expression controlled no visible surprise, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Your Grace," he said to Alaric, then, again softer, to Elowen. Your Grace. Elowen froze for half a heartbeat. Alaric didn't press her forward. He leaned closer and spoke quietly, only for her. Only if you wish to enter. Elowen looked at the open doors. Warm light inside. Staff lined neatly. Eyes respectful, not curious, not mocking, not pitying. You are asking me, she whispered, barely believing her own words. Alaric's voice was calm. I will not order you into your own life. Your own life. The phrase struck her like a physical thing. No one had ever spoken about her future as if it belonged to her. Elowen stepped forward, not because she was being led, because she had been asked. Inside the entry hall, Alaric turned to the older man. Mr. Halbrook, have the west chamber prepared for the Duchess. And tea. Nothing too heavy. Then, without making it a performance, he turned to Elowen again. Would you prefer tea, he asked, or would you rather be left alone for an hour? Elowen stood still, the question echoing strangely in her mind. A choice. Again. Tea, she answered softly, as if she were still learning what it felt like to let her voice shape her surroundings. Alaric nodded as though her preference was not surprising, but expected. Tea, then. Mr. Halbrook hesitated slightly, as if deciding how to address her, how to navigate this sudden new reality. Alaric spoke before the hesitation could become awkward. Her name is Elowen, he said evenly. See that no one in this house forgets it. The statement was not loud, but it was absolute. Elowen turned her head slightly toward him. In the Vale estate, she had been the girl. Your sister. Or worse. Here he spoke her name like it mattered. It hurt softly, deeply, in a way she didn't have words for. Tea was served in a quiet west sitting room where fire burned steadily in a hearth. The tray was simple thin toast, butter honey. Not lavish, not stingy. Just enough. Elowen sat on the edge of the chair as if she might vanish if she leaned back. Her body did not trust comfort yet. Alaric sat across from her, not looming, not dominating the space, but present. After a while he asked gently, as if he knew the question wasn't small. Would you like your maid sent for from the Vale house, he said, or would you rather not return anyone there? Elowen's head lifted quickly. The question cut straight to a fear she hadn't named, the fear of pulling her old life into this new place and contaminating it with the same cruelty. Iris, she said in a whisper, if she is willing. I would like Iris. Alaric nodded once. Then Iris will be sent for. No interrogation, no skepticism, no demand that she justify her attachment. Elowen stared at him, stunned by the ease with which he granted her that small anchor. Later, when he offered to show her the room prepared for her, Elowen rose and followed him, but she kept a careful distance, no sleeves brushing, no shoulders close. Not politeness, defense. Alaric didn't comment. He simply adjusted his pace to match hers, stopping at the stairhead in a silent offer, you first if you want. Elowen shook her head. He didn't insist. Halfway up the stairs, she heard herself speak, voice tight. I don't know what you expect of me, Alaric answered, from one step behind his tone, steady as a handrail. Nothing tonight, he said, and nothing tomorrow, that you do not choose to give. Elowen stopped for a fraction of a second. Breath caught. She had prepared herself for demands, for payment, for gratitude required. Not this. Her room, her chamber was warm and orderly, curtains drawn to soften the light. A basin of water prepared, a simple nightgown laid out, everything made ready without being theatrical. It should have soothed her. Instead, it unsettled her because cruelty was familiar. Kindness felt like a trap she didn't know how to avoid. At the door with only the two of them in the hall, Eloan asked the question that had been tightening in her chest since the church. "Why did you really do it?" Alaric met her gaze. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. Then he said quietly, as if he were confessing an inconvenient truth, "Because leaving you there would have been a greater wrong than marrying you without warning." Her eyes stung, and she hated that. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't charm. It was principle spoken by someone who seemed to actually believe in it. That night, a message came through Mr. Halbrook. "His Grace asks whether you would care for company." The older man said, with impeccable neutrality, "Only if you wish it." Eloan didn't know why she agreed. Perhaps because her world had been shattered and rebuilt in the span of a day, and nothing felt stable except the strange steadiness of Alaric's restraint. In the small room beside the library, Alaric stood near the fire when she entered. He turned immediately but didn't approach, leaving space between them like a gift. Eloan stood opposite. Fingers interlaced her body, still braced for impact. "You keep speaking as though I survived something extraordinary," she said, trying for sharpness and finding only exhaustion. "You did," Alaric replied without hesitation. Eloan gave a thin, bitter laugh. "I merely stood there while they said what everyone has always thought." Alaric watched her in silence for a long moment. Then his voice lowered rougher, not with emotion spilling over, but with truth sharpened by it. "No," he said. "You endured what others would not survive, and they called it weakness." The sentence struck a place in her that Cedric's cruelty had never touched. Eloan opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She had not cried in the church. Not when Cedric laughed. Not when Lysandra took his hand. Not when Lady Marceline sat in her cold certainty. But here in a quiet room with a man who didn't raise his voice, who didn't pity her, who didn't demand she be stronger than she already was. Her vision blurred. She turned her face away, quickly ashamed of tears, as if they were a failure. "I am sorry," she whispered. Alaric's answer came at once, gentle, firm. "Do not apologize for being seen." Something inside Eloan broke, not violently, not theatrically. It simply gave way after years of holding. Tears fell. Silent at first, then more. Not the desperate sobs of melodrama, but the long-delayed collapse of a person who has been upright for too long. Alaric did not move to embrace her. He did not touch her without permission. He simply stayed present, solid, allowing her to cry without making her feel like she was burdening the room. After a while, when her breathing steadied, he stepped closer by only a fraction and placed a clean handkerchief on the small table beside her. He didn't press it into her hand. He left it there so she could choose. Eloan stared at it, then at him. She took it, fingers trembling, faintly, and wiped her face. "You make it sound as though I am worth something," she murmured, voice raw. Alaric held her gaze. "No," he said. "I speak as though your worth does not change because cruel people refuse to see it." Eloan's grip tightened on the handkerchief. She didn't know how to believe him, but for the first time she wanted to try. When the clock struck late, Alaric stepped back, returning space to her as naturally as breathing. "You have had enough for one day," he said. "Rest. Tomorrow will not ask anything of you that tonight has not already taken." Eloan rose. At the door she paused, not turning, fully, voice quiet. "Thank you for not looking at me the way they do." A beat of silence. Then Alaric answered, low and unmistakable, "Then do not ask me to start." Eloan walked down the hall to her room, and for the first time in many years, She did not feel like she was retreating into a corner of a house where she was unwanted. She was simply going to sleep. And even that felt like a beginning. The days that followed moved with a strange calm, like the quiet after a storm when the world is still wet, but the sky has begun to clear. Iris arrived at Thornfield House the next morning, her face pale with worry until she saw Elowyn standing in the west sitting room with a cup of tea and an expression that wasn't fear. Iris's eyes filled instantly. Oh, she breathed, crossing the room in 2 quick steps. "Oh, Elowyn!" Elowyn caught her hands, feeling them shake. "I'm here," Elowyn said softly. "I'm all right." Iris looked around as if she expected the walls to reveal hidden cruelty. Then she lowered her voice. "They're talking about it everywhere. Not the wedding. Him." Elowyn stiffened slightly. Iris leaned closer, glancing towards the corridor. No one realized how much power the Duke truly holds until after he left that church with you. Elowyn let that sink in. She felt no satisfaction in it, only a bitter clarity. People had not changed their gaze because it was right. They had changed it because it was dangerous not to. Less than 3 days after the wedding, Mr. Halbrook entered the west sitting room with measured caution. Lady Marceline Vale, Miss Lysandra Vale, and Mr. Cedric Ashbourne request an audience. Iris's body tensed, immediate and protective. Elowyn's fingers tightened around her teacup. Alaric, seated opposite, watched Elowyn's face and asked without pressure, as if he were asking whether she wanted the window opened. "Do you wish to see them?" Elowyn didn't answer at once. She stared at the fire, at the steady flame that did not flicker with fear. "If I refuse," she said quietly, "they will come again." Alaric nodded. "Most likely." Elowyn set the cup down carefully, her spine straightening by degrees. "Then I would rather hear them once, and clearly." Alaric didn't praise her. He didn't soften it into something easier. He simply turned to Mr. Halbrook. "Show them to the north drawing room," he said, "and no one enters unless summoned." The north drawing room was large and cool, its high windows flooding the space with pale daylight that did nothing to warm it. Dark drapes framed the glass. The air smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Elowyn entered beside Alaric. This time she did not walk behind anyone. She walked level with him. Lady Marceline rose at once, dressed in black pearls and perfect control. But there was something new behind her composure urgency. Lysandra stood at her shoulder, beautiful and tense, her confidence less certain than Elowyn had ever seen it. Cedric stood slightly behind them, his expression drawn. His earlier arrogance replaced by something harder to name. Regret, perhaps, or calculation dressed as remorse. Elowyn saw immediately what had changed. They were no longer looking at her as someone who had no right to speak. They were weighing their words as if she mattered now, and the realization chilled her more than their open cruelty ever had. Lady Marceline smiled with practiced elegance. "Your Grace, thank you for receiving us on such short notice." Alaric did not offer her a chair. He did not return her smile. "Say what you came to say, Lady Marceline." A brief crack flickered in her expression. Then she recovered, turning to Elowyn with a softness she had never once used in private. "Elowyn, darling, what happened at the church was regrettable. Deeply regrettable. We all acted in a moment of shock." Elowyn stood still, unmoved by the word darling. Lady Marceline continued, voice smooth, as if presenting a sensible solution. "This marriage was performed under extraordinary circumstances, in haste, under emotional strain. It need not remain binding." Iris, seated near the far wall at Elowen's request, inhaled sharply. Elowen didn't look at her. She kept her gaze on Lady Marceline, feeling something in her spine harden. Lady Marceline's eyes flicked toward Lysandra, then back, and she spoke the next sentence as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. A discreet annulment could still be arranged. Elowen did not blink. Lady Marceline placed her gloved hand on Lysandra's wrist. It would spare everyone further embarrassment. And of course, if the Duke truly wishes to maintain a union with our family, Lysandra would be the more suitable match. Silence snapped tight across the room. Lysandra lifted her chin slightly, neither protesting nor denying, as if she had been waiting all along for the world to correct itself back into her favor. Elowen felt her hands go cold. Even now, even after everything, they still saw her as an object that could be exchanged when the price changed. Cedric stepped forward half a pace, his face drawn into something that tried to resemble sincerity. I never meant for it to go that far. Elowen turned her eyes toward him. One look was enough to make him falter. What happened at the church was rash, he said quickly. I was angry, confused. Elowen almost laughed at the audacity. Confused. As if humiliation had been an accident, as if cruelty had slipped out of him like a careless mistake. Cedric's gaze slid over Elowen's posture, over the way she stood beside Alaric, now no longer abandoned, no longer small. Elowen understood with a sick clarity he wasn't mourning her. He was mourning what he had lost by discarding her. Alaric had been silent through all of it, letting the room expose itself. Then he turned his head slightly toward the door. Mr. Halbrook, he said, bring the portfolio. Lady Marceline's expression changed just for a fraction of a second. Enough to be seen. A chill ran down Elowen's spine. Mr. Halbrook returned with a black-tied folder and placed it on the low table between them. Alaric didn't open it at once. He looked at Lady Marceline steadily. You came here believing title and urgency would force my hand, he said calmly. That was your first mistake. His voice was even, but there was a blade in the restraint. Then he opened the portfolio. He drew out aged papers, the edges yellowed with time, and placed the first document in front of Elowen, turning it so she could read. Elowen stared. The handwriting was old careful. A doctor's letter. Lady Marceline's face tightened as if the room had suddenly grown colder. Alaric spoke without looking down. It took less time than I expected to confirm what I already suspected. Elowen's eyes moved over the lines. A statement of medical fact. A complication anticipated weeks before. A death not caused by a child, but by a rare and unavoidable condition. Her lungs tightened painfully. All her life she had grown under a sentence, your mother died because of you. With a few lines of ink, that sentence collapsed. Alaric's voice cut through the room, clear and final. She was never the cause of her mother's death. The air in the drawing room became almost unbreathable. Lady Marceline's voice hardened. That proves nothing. Misfortune followed the girl all the same. Alaric's gaze lifted to her. Then he placed another stack of letters on the table. Correspondence to distant relations, notes to former servants. Casual lines dressed as concern that repeated one message over and over. Elowen is unlucky. Elowen is unsuitable. Elowen should be kept out of view. He looked at Lady Marceline as if she were a problem to be solved, not a person to be spared. You cultivated the story carefully, he said. Not loudly. That would have looked cruel. Quietly, over years. just enough that other people would repeat it for you. Alaric turned her head toward her stepmother. For the first time, Lady Marceline did not meet her eyes at once. That small avoidance was more damning than any confession. Alaric felt something twist inside her, not just anger, but grief. A sick grief for the years she had spent believing a lie because it was easier for everyone else if she did. Alaric placed another set of papers down, lists of expenditures, invitations, introductions. The wealth poured into Lysandra's seasons, her dresses, her placements, her polish. Meanwhile, Elowen's expenses were cut, delayed, forgotten. One daughter was presented to society as refinement grace and promise, Alaric said evenly. The other was left in the shadows so the contrast would hold. Lysandra's cheeks flushed. "I did not ask for that," she snapped. Alaric voice when it came was quiet and sharper than any shout. "No," she said, eyes fixed on her sister. "You merely accepted it. Every time." Lysandra's mouth tightened. Her eyes wavered not fully with remorse, more with shock at being spoken to as an equal. Alaric took out the last document with more care than the others. A legal paper. Sealed. He slid it toward Elowen. She saw her father's name, Lord Edwin Vale, and her throat tightened painfully. Alaric spoke slowly, clearly. "Your father established a private settlement in your name 6 months before his death." Elowen's head lifted stunned. No, it wasn't denial. It was disbelief too large to hold. The settlement included income from 2 parcels of leased land and a modest trust intended to remain untouched until your marriage or your 30th year, Alaric continued. Elowen turned her gaze to Lady Marceline. Her voice shook not with weakness, but with shock. "You told me there was nothing." Lady Marceline lifted her chin, trying to rebuild control with posture alone. It was managed as part of the household. Alaric's voice turned colder, still quiet, but absolute. "No," he said. It was diverted. The statement fell like a verdict. Lady Marceline stepped forward, eyes flashing, with the old manipulative certainty. "You do not understand what it took to preserve this family," she said, sharply turning to Elowen. "She brings ruin wherever she goes." That sentence had once been enough to make Elowen shrink. But now, with paper proof on the table and truth standing beside her, it sounded like what it was habit. The reflex of a woman who needed someone weaker to carry her failures. Elowen looked at her stepmother. For the first time, she did not feel like she was looking up. Her shoulders opened, her spine straightened, her voice was steady. "No." One word, small, clean, and it sliced through years of fear. Alaric took a step forward. "No," she said again, stronger. "You did." Lady Marceline's eyes widened a fraction, as if she couldn't comprehend Elowen speaking in that tone. Elowen continued each sentence, a stone laid down to rebuild herself. "You needed every sorrow in that house to belong to someone weaker than you. You needed every loss to have a face you could point at. You needed me to carry your failures, so Lysandra could look brighter beside me." No one interrupted. No one could. "You called me a curse so often that eventually I believed it." Elowen said, voice calm and deadly honest. "That was never truth. It was convenience." Lady Marceline took a half step back. Alaric saw it, and she understood something she had never understood before. Power wasn't volume. Power was refusing to believe the cage was real. Alaric stepped closer, not in front of Alaric, not shielding her, but beside her, aligning himself with her rather than replacing her voice. "She was never the curse," he said, his tone clipped and final. "You simply needed her to be one." Then looking directly at Lady Marceline, he added, You built a lie and fed it to everyone around her until it sounded like tradition. Cedric suddenly stepped forward, voice strained, desperate. Elowen. I made a mistake. It sounded like a plea. Like a man trying to pretend this could be repaired by regret. Elowen turned toward him, seeing him clearly now. Not the charming man in the garden, but the cruelty beneath the charm finally exposed. No, she said. Cedric blinked, confused. Elowen's voice remained even almost gentle because she did not need rage to be powerful anymore. You revealed who you are. Cedric opened his mouth, but Elowen didn't give him the stage again. A mistake is spilling wine, she said. A mistake is forgetting a name. What you did was deliberate. Cedric went rigid. Elowen held his gaze one more beat, then closed the last door quietly and permanently. You did not lose me at the altar, she said. You proved you were never worthy of me to begin with. Iris turned her face away, eyes bright with tears not of pity, but of fierce pride. Lady Marsaline looked around the room as if expecting someone to rescue her, to take her side. No one did. Lysandra's face had gone pale, her mouth tight, her eyes flicking with panic. Alaric tilted his head slightly toward the door. Mr. Halbrook. The door opened immediately as if the house itself obeyed him. Lady Marceline's jaw clenched. She tried to salvage a last thread of threat. This is not over. Alaric did not raise his voice. It is he said in this house. Lysandra left first, her steps no longer regal, her shoulders tense. Cedric hesitated as if he wanted to say something more, some line that might soften his fall. Elowen's single look stopped him cold. He turned and followed. The door closed behind them. The room became too quiet. Elowen stared at the papers still spread on the table. Proof, truth, the past rewritten in ink and seal. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like grief, a different kind of pain. Pain for the years she had lived under a lie. Pain for the life she might have had if truth had been given to her sooner. Her fingers drifted toward the document with her father's name. She traced the letters lightly, as if touching him through paper. Her voice was small, almost to herself. He tried. Alaric stood beside her without interrupting the moment. After a pause long enough to honor it, he said quietly, "Yes, and now so will I." Elowen turned to look at him. In the church he had saved her from humiliation. Here he had stood for truth. And for the first time, Elowen didn't see him as a stranger who had intervened. She saw him as a man who had chosen her life with intention. Thornfield House returned to its calm rhythm, but Elowen did not return to being a shadow within it. In the days after Alaric brought the legal documents to the study and sat with her at the desk, explaining each section with patient clarity, he never made her feel foolish for not knowing. He never took control out of her hands. "Then we begin with the first page," he said one afternoon when she stared at the ink-heavy language like it was another kind of trap. No one is born knowing how to reclaim what was taken from them. Elowen sat down and opened the portfolio, her hands steady. It wasn't just money being returned, it was ownership. Letters began arriving addressed to Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield. Each time Mr. Halbrook read the title softly, Elowen felt a strange jolt in her chest, not pride exactly, more like disbelief that the world could speak to her without contempt. Once Alaric watched her hold an envelope as if it might burn. "Does it trouble you?" he asked. Elowen thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "No." "It startles me." Alaric nodded, not amused. "Then let it startle you for as long as it needs to," he said. "It is still yours." Those words stayed with her all day. Yours. Not borrowed, not stolen, not given with strings attached, yours. One morning, Iris helped her choose a dress for a walk in the South Garden. Alaric absent-mindedly said Lysandra always preferred lighter colors, then stopped mid-sentence as if she'd caught herself repeating an old script. Iris met her eyes in the mirror. Then it is fortunate no one is dressing Miss Lysandra, Iris said, gentle but firm. Alaric's lips curved into a small laugh, her first in a long time that didn't taste bitter. She chose a deep blue dress because she liked it. That was all. And that was everything. Love did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like warmth creeping into a room that had been cold for years. Alaric asked her preference at breakfast tea with honey or sugar toast or fruit before he ever signaled servants. He asked her opinion before replying to invitations. He included her without making it a spectacle. He did not rush intimacy. He did not demand gratitude. He treated trust like something built stone by stone through repetition of respect. Alaric's body, conditioned by years of bracing for harm, did not relax quickly. Some nights she still woke with the sound of the church in her ears, the word curse falling like a stone. Once she woke trembling and sat up silently, trying not to make noise. Thornfield was so quiet even her breath sounded loud. The connecting door between their rooms opened a fraction. Alaric stood there, not stepping in, leaving the choice in her hands. "Do you want company?" he asked. Not, "What happened?" Not, "You are overreacting," just the simplest question. Alaric's throat tightened. She nodded once. Alaric brought her a glass of warm water and sat near the fire, not on her bed. Not too close. Present it without invading. They barely spoke. His presence alone steadied her. In the morning he didn't mention the night. He didn't turn her vulnerability into a topic. That restraint taught her something new. She could be fragile here and not be punished for it. Spring returned slowly. One rainy afternoon, Alaric found Alaric in his study coat, damp at the shoulders, gloves on the desk, papers spread in orderly stacks. He had been out on the estate settling a dispute for tenants, the kind of work that earned no applause. Alaric stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, watching him. Responsibility sat on him like a second skin, quiet, uncomplaining. "Do you always do so much yourself?" she asked. Alaric looked up, removing one glove. "When it matters, yes." Alaric took a few steps inside. Before she would have stayed at the threshold, afraid of being a nuisance. Now she sat in the chair opposite him, as if she belonged there. "Then perhaps next time," she said softly, "it can matter to both of us." A faint change warmed his expression. "I would like that," he replied. It wasn't a declaration, but it was a doorway. A month later, in the South Garden, where new rosebuds had begun to form, Alaric stopped in the middle of the stone path. The light was gentle, the air cool, the world quiet enough to hear leaves moving. He didn't dramatize the moment. He simply spoke as if he could no longer keep the truth behind his teeth. "I do not know when respect ended and something else began," he said, eyes on her. "Perhaps it was always both. But I know this now. I love you, Alaric." Alaric expected fear. Instead, she felt peace. A deep, steady peace, like something in her had known she could only hear those words once she was safe enough to believe them. "I think," she said, stepping closer, voice soft but steady, "I began loving you the day you asked me whether I wished to enter my own home." A faint smile touched his mouth. Alaric lifted her hand and touched his first. "And I know this now. I love you too." Love did not turn them into wildfire. It turned them into home. He remembered she liked honey instead of sugar. She remembered he worked too long and forgot to eat. He asked her opinions because he respected them. She walked beside him without shrinking because she no longer believed she needed to. Before a concert in London, Elowen paused in front of the mirror, smoothing her gloves, and asked half-jokingly, "Do you think they still whisper when I enter?" Alaric stood behind her, not touching, until her eyes in the reflection settled. Perhaps he said, "But now they do it because they know you hear none of them." Elowen looked at herself in the mirror. She did not see a bride waiting for judgment. She saw herself. A year after that wedding, the wedding that had begun as a public cruelty and ended as a public choice summer, spread across Thornfield like a blessing. Roses bloomed thick in the garden. Windows were open to catch warm breezes. The house moved with a soft, careful busyness. Elowen stood by the window in her chamber with one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, breathing slowly. Iris folded soft linens behind her smile, bright with nervous joy. "His Grace has worn a path into the carpet this week," Iris murmured with a gentle laugh. "If he paces any more, Mr. Halbrook may have to replace the runner." Elowen smiled and looked down the corridor, imagining Alaric's controlled anxiety, his careful restraint fraying at the edges because he could not control this the way he controlled everything else. She didn't feel burdened by his worry. She felt held by it. When the first true pain came, it came hard enough to steal her breath. Elowen gripped the bedpost, knuckles whitening. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. Hours blurred into a rhythm of pain, whispered reassurance. Iris's steady hands, the midwife's calm instructions, and beyond the door, the tense presence of a man Elowen could feel as surely as if he were in the room. Then a cry, sharp, strong, undeniable. Elowen's breath hitched and tears spilled from her eyes before she understood she was crying. The midwife wrapped the baby in soft cloth and smiled warmly. "A son, Your Grace." Elowen took him carefully, trembling as her fingers touched his cheek. Warm, real, alive. For a moment a memory flashed, a distant room. A mother who never held her child. This time the story did not repeat. When Alaric was finally allowed in, he entered with a reverence that nearly broke Elowen's heart. A man who had faced a church full of judgment, without blinking, now moved as if he feared his own breath might disturb something holy. Elowen looked up at him, exhausted, but bright-eyed. "Come here," she whispered. Alaric approached slowly and knelt by the bedside so he would be at their level. Elowen shifted the bundle toward him. Alaric took his son like he was receiving the most precious responsibility of his life. He stared down at the tiny face, the small mouth, the curled fingers. His usual control softened into something pure. Elowen watched him, and understanding struck her so hard it felt like relief. This child would never grow up with whispers around his name. No one would call him the cause of tragedy. No one would place their fear onto his small shoulders. Alaric brushed his fingertip gently across the baby's hand, then spoke, voice low and steady, as a vow. He will never doubt his worth. Elowen felt the sentence echo backward through every year she had lived, believing she was less than human. Her throat tightened. She reached out, touching the baby's tiny hand, and the fingers closed around her fingertip with instinctive trust. A simple gesture. A world-ending one. Elowen whispered, barely audible, "Neither will I." Alaric looked up at her, then eyes softened with a tenderness that didn't need words. In the days that followed, Thornfield House filled with quiet sounds, soft footsteps, murmured voices, the scent of clean linens and summer flowers. When Elowen carried her son down the hall, servants lowered their heads with uncomplicated respect. No one looked at the child with suspicion. No one inspected him as if hunting for bad omens. One morning, sunlight barely touching the stained glass, Aloan stood beside the cradle watching her son sleep. Alaric approached from behind and placed his warm hand at the center of her back, not possessive, simply present. Aloan's eyes didn't leave the cradle. "I used to think the curse was me," she said softly. Alaric's voice was low and certain. "It never was." Aloan nodded slowly. "No," she whispered. "It was the lie, the fear." The cruelty passed from one hand to another until someone finally refused to carry it. She turned her head and looked at him. The woman he saw now was not the bride who had stood frozen at the altar. She was a duchess. Yes, but more than that, she was a person who had reclaimed herself. Aloan rested her hand on the cradle edge and spoke with quiet clarity. "They called me a curse." A small pause like the final breath of an old ghost. Then her mouth curved, not bitter, not triumphant, simply peaceful. "But I was the one who ended it." And so the girl they once called a curse became the one who ended it by choosing herself when no one else would. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved, you don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, and consider subscribing for more stories like this. There are many more journeys waiting to be told, and we'd love to have you with us for the next one.